For me, I am literally going through the script. I try to just come up with three different ideas for every single moment of choice within the script. Like this romance scene, what if it's actually a fight? What if like this line here is actually this person trying to attack the other person? And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense at all upon first read, but what if? Hi, I'm Bing Liu, and welcome to the Screenplayed Breakdown.
Today, I'm here with Bing Liu, Oscar nominated director of Minding the Gap and most recently, Preparation for the Next Life. Thanks for joining us, Bing.
Thanks for having me.
So, for people who haven't had the chance to see your newest film, could you give us a brief overview of what it's about?
Yeah, so Preparation for the Next Life, it's actually based on a novel, but the film that we've made out of it is about a Uyghur woman who is from Western China. She immigrates to the United States illegally. So she's undocumented, and she's trying to make her way in New York, and she meets a young Army veteran who just got back from a few tours overseas. And they have this whirlwind romantic relationship that takes off really quickly, and she has to decide whether or not she wants to build a life with him or not.
But maybe we should wait.
Maybe we shouldn't. If there's something that you want to do, you better do it today. You have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow.
And how did this project come to you?
It came to me because I was touring with Minding the Gap in 2018, and I was at a film festival, a documentary film festival called Mountain Film Telluride, and Barry Jenkins was a jury member at that festival, and so I met him, and he saw my documentary, and he sent me this book afterward, Preparation for the Next Life, and he was like, "Hey, actually, I've been developing it as a series for a while, but I think I'm looking for somebody else to take it on." And so I read the book and I was like, great, yeah, I think I see this more as a feature. But I would love to sign on to try to do this.
Did you have to pitch Barry on this new idea to take it as a feature, or what was the process from the years and when you met and started discussing to actually day one on set?
Well, it was 6 years ago, so I might have trouble remembering how the chronology of the timelines exactly, but I remember talking a lot with Mark Seriak, who is one of his execs at his company, one of the producers that works at Pastel, and we talked for a while, and then eventually I went and met with Jeremy Kleiner and Dee Dee Gardner at Plan B, who was also attached to the project already. And we were meeting to go pitch the studio that was financing it at the time. And we met and had a little bit of a chat beforehand. And they just asked me, like, what do you like about the book? Like what resonates with you? And I was like, well, I think I'm really excited that we're telling the story of a Uyghur woman. I think that's just, kind of a rare representation in storytelling. But I really see a version of my mom's story in this novel. My mom worked in Chinese restaurants after we immigrated here. We were undocumented for a little bit, and she not only met a lot of guys who she had kind of really complicated relationships with, but within that I think she really struggled to find her meaning in life, in going through those experiences. And so I think I was really attracted to what the one of the main relationships in the novel, which was this relationship between this Uyghur woman and this young army veteran. But I say all that because there's a third character that I immediately was like, I don't know about this third character. I don't know if I necessarily want to include him as a fully fleshed out character. In fact, I see this third character as somebody who can be embodied by this army veteran as well, in a sense, kind of deepening this army veteran character and giving him more sides, so to speak, for us to explore. And they're like, great, like, why don't you just talk about all that, when we go into this meeting? And so that's what I did. And the studio really resonated with what I spoke about, so we were off to the races from there.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And then, as you were saying, it was 6 years from first introduction to the book towards production. Do you find it difficult to keep up hope for a project as in that long of a time span?
I was really lucky in some ways because all of this was just I mean, I worked really hard on getting to the place where I got to in my career, but I didn't expect to get the opportunity to become a film director. I went to community college. I went to a 4-year state school after that to become a high school English teacher. I happened to start working on the crew side because I had done a lot of skate videos when I was growing up, and I had some technical know-how, and I just cold called the cinematographer, and he kind of took me under his wing a little bit, and I learned how to be a grip, an electric. I learned how to be a PA. I learned especially how to do work in the camera department, which was the guild, the IATSE Local 600 guild that the cinematographer belonged to. And eventually he started bringing me out in bigger and bigger sets. And by the time I graduated college, I was able to join the union and started working on my first union movie. And so throughout my 20s, I worked my way up the camera department. I was a loader, a second AC, a focus puller. And then, I was always making my own work on the side in the way that I saw other skateboarder artists do. Like I would just like make stuff and just put up on Vimeo and without a kind of career plan or anything. Um, but Minding the Gap was something that took off. And while I was making Minding the Gap, I also got hired to work in a series called America to Me, which got me the opportunity to join the Directors Guild. And so in 2018, I go to Sundance with two projects, America to Me and Minding the Gap. A lot of agents reach out to me. They start, it was like the quote unquote golden age of documentary, 2018. There was Free Solo, there was the Mr. Rogers documentary. Like documentaries were making money at the box office. Um, and so there was a interest in a lot of fiction producers and studios to try to develop fiction movies with documentary filmmakers. That was the context of what was happening, both personally in my life and in the industry. And so, to answer your question, it wasn't hard because it was just all so bonus to me. I was just kind of, like glad to be there in a way. Um, and in addition to that, I just got really busy after Minding the Gap. My second documentary that I started developing before Minding the Gap was completed, got greenlit like a couple months after our Sundance premiere. So I just jumped into this documentary about Chicago gun violence, and these programs that are trying to prevent it from happening by working with the communities in which are most affected. And it's a heavy verite film. I'm like in Chicago a lot with my co-director, filming, and then I'm traveling to film festivals. And then I started developing other fiction projects. At one point, I was developing 4 fiction projects at the same time. And so that's, was all happening concurrently with preparation for the next life. And so I didn't even know, if preparation for the next life was going to be the film that I would make, after All These Sons, my second documentary. And, it was both a mixture of the scarcity mentality that I had growing up, just like being in an immigrant household, being in a working class city like Rockford, and then coming up through the crew side in which you're taught just always say yes, because you don't never know where the next project's going to come from or where the next paycheck's going to come from. And so I said yes to almost too much, I would say. Um, but I think it worked out at the time. I was still like relatively young and I had the energy for it. But I got it. There was a cost to it. I really got burnt out, and I had started having all these health issues like eczema and like bowel syndromes, and so it was a lot. But I think there was a sort of there were times with every single one of my projects where I was like, "Oh, the project's dead. It's just I don't think it's gonna happen," And then there were other times where like I think it's gonna go, And then it's like it was a lot of hurry up and wait.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think to many of the listeners, they don't realize they see a movie announced, it's shot, it's edited, and they don't realize just the immense amount of waiting that happens behind the scenes for something to actually come into existence. So, as you mentioned, with shooting documentaries, it's hours and hours upon shooting. Did you find that influenced or changed your approach to directing a feature, which I've heard in an interview you said you either did 2 takes or 12? That overabundance of shooting versus the limited and actually pretty well structured schedule of a feature film.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that working with the what we so I was working with the screenwriter Martina Mayok, and you know, she had been interested in the novel for a while. Like she was a fan of the book for a while, and she was kind of always interested in it. And I think Plan B knew that. And so when we were going out to look for writers, they sent me her samples as part of the package of writing samples that I looked at, and I read her plays Cost of Living and Ironbound, which are amazing. And Ironbound is actually, you know, partially set in Chicago, where I spent a lot of time. And she's an immigrant herself. You know, grew up with an immigrant mom who had a very complicated life, kind of like my mom did, and you know, so we hit it off pretty quickly. But I knew that you know this was her first screenplay that was going to get produced, and I knew that you know a lot of her work was just so performance based. And so, you know, we kind of leaned into that. And so I think going into the production of the movie, I knew this movie was going to live or die by the performances. And so everything was kind of structured around how do we make sure the performances work and how do we give ourselves room to play with the performances so that, you know, we can do what I'm used to, which is a big rewrite in the edit if we have to, or that we get to, in my opinion, because I think, you know, in documentary, like so much of the fun of it is sort of trying to build the story and finding the story in the edit. Um, so yeah, I think it was, you know, well structured because it had to be, but within working with my two lead actors, we built a system of working in which we kind of broke out of the structure a lot. And you know, it wasn't really about like getting it right. It was about, you know, trying to explore and find the truth in different ways.
I mean, and on top of that, not only trying to explore, you're dealing with Sabia, which is this is her first feature film, and then with Fred, who has had more films under his belt. But what did that process of playing around or rehearsing look like? What were you trying to get out of the actors or make them feel?
Yeah, so I had taken so I'd taken about a little over a year of acting classes in preparation for not just this film, but you know some of the other fiction projects I was developing. And I'd audited a few classes. I spent a year and a half living in LA during the pandemic, and um, I had audited a couple classes out there, and you know one of them just didn't feel like um, it spoke to me or how I wanted my process to start forming. Um, and, you know, it was kind of just like listening to a lot of veterans kind of sitting around talking about, like, oh, you know, when I worked with Stella Adler, you know, she said this. Um, but then I met this guy named Jeff Marcus off of a recommendation of an actor who I'd met. And I was really glad that I took his recommendation because I went and I met with Jeff and I started auditing his classes. And he has this really small setup in a garage behind his house. They turned into a home studio. So the classes are very small. You know, it's like maybe like 8, 9 people per class. You know, and it's a lot of it's the usual stuff. It's like, you know, you do scene work, you know, you take a scene, you have a scene partner, and then you like do scenes and you like work in the scenes week after week. Um, but I think he had a kind of emotional intelligence and almost, I want to say, like trauma informed way of working in which he recognized that a lot of our personal lives and a lot of our um, issues that we have stored up in our bodies, you know, in our psychology and our brains, like all of that matters. All of that affects the work we're doing. And so, you know, a lot of times, instead of doing scene work, you know, we a lot of us would elect to do exercises that would help sort of unlock these personal blockages or tap into, you know, the personal blockages to turn them from blockages um, into a kind of superpower for us to access the scene in a different way. So a lot of that I brought into my process. I'd say the other part of the process that I brought into um, my own process is is skateboarding, is making skate videos. When you make a skate video, you know, a lot of people think you're just pointing the camera haphazardly and people are just randomly doing tricks. But honestly, it's more like a production. Like, you know, like to make a skateboarding video is kind of, making an album in a way. And you have to, and people like skaters are very intentional about how they want their individual skate part to look like, what they want their song to be, what they want their style to look like, their trick selection, the order of their tricks, how they want their tricks to look. And so you as the skate videographer are going out there and you're going and essentially trying to, capture these tricks in a way that they're happy with, that and that you're happy with. But what you're asking them to do and what they are asking themselves to do is a very scary thing. They can like literally get hurt. And so you're starting to maybe see the analogy of like what you're like asking actors to do. And so you take on all these roles as a skate videographer. You're a little bit of a coach, you're like, oh, maybe you should try doing it like this way. Or maybe, if you like went a little faster, or, maybe you just put some more wax on the ledge. At other times, you're kind of acting as a little bit of a therapist, like oftentimes you're filming a skate trick for like 2 hours and they still can't get it. And they're like freaking out and they're throwing their board around. And you're like, hey, can I get you some water? Like, do you want to talk about it? Or like, maybe just take a break, Um, and so, it's like at the end of the day, though, like skateboarding is play, and you don't know what's actually going to work. What you do know is that you have to keep trying things, trying different things in order to see what will work. Um, and I think like all of that I brought into my process with Fred and Sabia. And then one final thing I'll say is I noticed while making Mind in the Gap, which is, more of a documentary film than a skate video, that when I interviewed these skateboarders after skateboarding, they were always more open and available than, if I just picked them up off of some life activity that they were doing, like hanging out or after work and then trying to talk to them. And I think the reason why that is that, like after skateboarding, it's kind of like you have a runner's high. You're like somatically more in your body. And so, the first thing that I had us do every time we met up for rehearsal was I would have us each choose a song that we wouldn't tell, any of the other people in our trio that we'd built. And we'd have to dance to all 3 songs nonstop, no questions asked, and without even really talking about anything else or greeting each other almost. It was our greeting. So it gave us a lot of information. It told us, okay, what is the song that's like speaking to us that day? It's a little bit of an icebreaker of like where we're at in terms of, you know. Um, and then it also just helps get us on the same page and like know that we can be silly together and like this is silly. And then I think most importantly, it put us into that like somatic runner's high space in which we all felt good together and we like did something really fun together. And then all of a sudden, we can sit down, we can immediately start in a much more open and available way. Um, so those are some of the things. There's more. I love talking about this aspect because I think it's where most of my energy and time and brain space went during the making of this film was just working with Fred and Sabia.
No, I mean, that's incredibly interesting to hear, and I mean, when watching preparation for the next life, I don't think I was personally thinking, skateboarding, except for that one scene where Sabia does a kickflip, and that was, I mean, that kinda came out of nowhere, but it was a very cool scene, I liked it.
Had to do is my version of a Hitchcock. I did when we went on location scouts. I would bring the location scouts to skate spots that happened to be very cinematic, and I felt really good whenever because these are like I was working with like kind of grizzled New York location managers and scouts. So a couple times I brought them to spots where like whoa I can't believe this exists. I'm like yep,
Mhm.
you get a whole view of Queens. And I only know about this because it's a skate spot. Yeah.
Was there a
Yeah.
temptation to use, like, the anamorphics for some really good, some skate videos?
Well, we had tested my cinematographer Auntie Chung. We had tested a lot of different formats and lenses, and I really wanted to go for something elevated to elevate this above social realism, which I think it could have. I think upon first reading the novel and developing the script with Martina, I think we all sort of saw the most obvious choice being something more social realist, like early Aronofsky.
Yeah.
And I think as we developed it more and more, we were like, I think these people's lives deserve a kind of more sweeping emotional perspective. I think, for the choices that they're having to make in their lives are banal and mundane, but to them it doesn't feel that way. So how do we represent that? But how do we not go overboard, and have it be like too much style over substance and have it take away from what has to work, which is the performance. And so eventually we landed on something that was in between anamorphic and spherical. Panavision made us some custom lenses that were 1.3 lenses. So it gave you a little bit of that anamorphic look, and at the same time, it didn't go overboard and you didn't get like the blue lens flares or anything like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's incredible. When I was watching it, it was bugging me. I was like, "Is this anamorphic? I can't tell." And I thought it was such an interesting choice because I think the first idea for anybody reading the script would be spherical, flat, kind of film it. These are just two people. But I think the choice to elevate it really does show that these characters' lives are as impactful as, I don't know, a large a Lawrence of Arabia or something like that, where there will be blood.
Mhm.
Now, I've heard you mention in other interviews, you spoke about the multiple truths that you can have in a scene and doing it wrong with the actors. When you approach a scene as a director, so are you not thinking about or the kind of Godfather way with Coppola, where he'd write down this is like the one thing the scene's about, gotta nail that. What are you thinking when you approach a scene? Are you just is it really just the looking to play in all regards?
Well, I'll talk about, we most of the time that we spend together in the room is I think bonus. I think a lot of the work that needs to be done is the actual script analysis beforehand.
Mm.
For me, I do always kind of start a little bit more broad, like what is the scene about to me? I'm literally going through the script, writing on the script, like what is the scene about to me? And then the next step is like what dramatically needs to happen in the scene? Like what is the change that needs to happen in the scene for these two characters? Um, and then from there, that's where it starts getting into, well, how do we accomplish that? That's where the play starts to happen for me as a somebody who's interpreting the script. And that's just about, all the myriad choices that are made, within each of the stage directions, within each of the lines, within each of the blank spaces between the lines or between the stage directions that might need to happen, or that you could come up with ideas to try to get at, the next beat. And so I'm literally going through the script, writing my ideas, and I try to just come up with three different ideas for every single moment of choice, a moment of change within the script, within the scene. Um, and so I think, like having that in my back pocket when I go meet up with Fred and Sabia is really helpful for me. Not just not in the same sense that not in the sense that like I want to impose my ideas onto them.
Mhm.
Um, I think I have to back up a little bit and say part of my philosophy comes from going to University of Illinois in Chicago and studying to become a high school English teacher. And we studied a lot of power dynamics within the classroom and where learning actually comes from. At the time, I think we were really challenging this top-down model of education and really trying to find ways of using the wisdom that kids already have in order to get them interested and excited so that they can do their best work, so that they can essentially add to the collective learning that could happen in a classroom. So I was bringing a lot of that philosophy into our rehearsal space. Um, and so I think, I felt really good knowing that, like, okay, I've not only come up with a lot of ideas and a lot of things that I'm excited by, but I've also expanded my sort of my view of what the scene could hold. I've challenged myself because a lot of the choices I was writing down weren't necessarily. I wasn't necessarily confident in most of them. In fact, like I tried to challenge myself to go like, this romance scene. What if it's actually a fight? What if like this line here is actually, somebody like this person trying to attack the other person? And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense at all upon first read. But what if, like that's part of my job is to think outside the box, and expand my horizons. That's the only way, innovation can shine through. And so I think one of my first uh, one of my first things I like to do is to try to get Fred and Sabia to also go there with me. Like, how can we think outside the box? But in order to do that, I need to hear their first initial, thoughts in the scene, their first initial ideas, and some of that's talking it out, some of that's just getting them up on their feet and sort of showing me, like, what are your instincts? Okay, great. Let's talk about like why you might have made those choices. Okay, now let's try to do the opposite. Let's try to do it wrong, as Fred would say. Fred taught me that language. Um, and so, sometimes there'd be blockages. They'd be like, "Ooh, yeah, this doesn't make sense. Why would they, you know, why would they try that?" And
Yeah.
I think that's where I brought in that those lessons that I got from that acting teacher in
Mhm.
LA, and we would start to get personal sometimes, not directly, but just through interrogation, I think we usually would get to some personal place where it's like, oh, like maybe, if this scene requires you to break up with a partner and you've never really broken up with a partner, I mean, yeah, of course, that's like, this is a foreign thing and you can't rely on instinct, we're going to have to work on that.
Right.
Um, and so, I think that was just kind of the process. It was like rinse, repeat. But I will say, because Martina is such a talented writer, I think the scenes could hold this kind of play and this
Mhm.
kind of work. Um, and I think we tried to make it as fun as possible too. We tried not to take ourselves too seriously. But I
Mhm.
remember earlier on, I think within a first couple days of rehearsal, we all had a chat and we were like, look, like this is how I like working this way. Do you guys like working this way? Because this is very time consuming, and
Right.
we're like but I would rather do it like this. I mean, Martina wrote this really dense script. We can treat it like a play essentially, and just really explore off the page and really embody these characters, um, and try to discover new things. And they were both down. They were open to working on weekends during production, and so every weekend we would rehearse the week of work that was going to be coming up, and I think it really gave us a lot of confidence going into production on that week coming up, to know that we already had a lot that we had explored.
Right. No, that makes sense, and I think you feel it on the screen. There's a certain amount of time that you feel has passed between these characters, that they're not just coming, to shoot. There we go. That they actually have spoken and know each other. Now, with that process of finding it and rehearsing it, was there ever a scene or something that, or a day on set that just didn't work, that you really struggled to get at something, but you couldn't figure out what it was?
Yeah, I mean, some of it didn't make it in the film for that reason.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was a day, or I think on our third day of filming,
Hmm.
we had filmed this. We try to preserve the chronology of the relationship building and then coming to a head and then falling apart as much as possible, but we couldn't always do it. And on the third day of filming, we had a gym scene, the gym montage scene, in which, this was so late into their relationship. They had experienced so much of their romantic build, and they're sort of coming to terms with who they really are, and one of them hurting the other, and this being a sort of coming back together scene.
Hmm.
And it was a lot to hold, I think, for both of them. But I think at a certain point, I just noticed something was off about Sabia. Like she like seemed a little bit just not locked in as I was so used to with her.
Hmm.
And I don't, I forget if it's like she that came, if I went up to her, but or she came up to me. But yeah, we just talked about it. We were like, "Yeah, what's going on?" She's like, "Yeah, I know. I feel something off." Um, and so we just talked about it. But I think it was an early kind of example of, oh, I'm realizing, like, I think we need to build a kind of communication while we're doing this, to so that you feel comfortable speaking up when you need to just work on something, like,
Hmm.
um, but we got there, like, I think, it's It's interesting. I think they kind of analogize our relationship as me being a parent.
Hmm.
They eventually would make jokes about that on set.
Yeah.
They'd be like running around, goofing off in a scene, like wrestling in a 99-cent store hallway, and it'd be like, we're like, chasing our 12th hour, and we need to wrap soon. And I'm just like
Yeah.
yelling across the set, which I don't like to do, but like I had to just save time. And they were just like, yes, dad, but yeah, it felt very much like that. Like it's like they did have their own, they felt almost like siblings in a way. Like they
Mhm.
felt like they had their own thing that was special to them, that they had built together. They went out to eat together. They like took trips to Flushing together. They spent their own time together, and so I think it was a little bit easier in the same way that I think I hear a lot of parents talk about. How it's a little bit easier to raise two siblings who are close in age because then they have each other. They're not just like alone. They have someone that's more like their peer.
Mhm.
But within being a parent, it felt almost like there were times where, in the same way that I hear a lot of parents talk about how like their kids kind of go through a little bit of a rebellious phase, or a little bit of a kind of brooding phase in which they like don't they stop letting you in or something, or they sort of just want to test their boundaries and your boundaries a little bit. And so that happened at times. I remember there was one scene in which it required Sabia to get really emotional, and I felt like, oh, perhaps this is just dipping over into melodrama, and we're like getting a little bit self-indulgent with the emotions. And she got a little upset. She was like, Bing, can I talk to you in private? And she was like, I think you need to trust me. Like, I know this character so well. And she did. Like, so much of what she responded to in the role was just it resonated with her personally. And I was like, okay, great. Like, and I was thinking, like, as a parent, like, I want her to feel heard, right? Like, I
Yeah.
don't want to dismiss her feelings. But at the same time, like, I need to just I need to make sure we stay on track, and I need her to trust me as well. So,
Mhm.
I made her feel heard. I was like, great, let's go with your instincts, but I also need you to trust me for this to work because I am your eyes and ears. And I think we need to try what I feel like is going to work as well. And so there would be moments like that where we'd have to negotiate.
Like kind of a one for you, one for them kind of thing with making a feature where make them feel comfortable doing their instinct, but at the end of the day, and then just you're saying after that, once she had performed what her instinctual desire was, saying, okay, next take, can we try maybe whatever your version was? Is that correct?
It's that, in addition to that, I feel like it's almost like having to sort of read, like, I mean, you're asking actors to get put in vulnerable places, and when you get put in a vulnerable place, you enter fight or flight mode, and so you
Mm.
will do things like either lash out or withdraw, or freeze up, and so I think it was sort of taking that into consideration and going like, man, she's been doing take after take of this, breaking down scene, like, um, she can't not be kind of starting to maybe want to lash out or withdraw or freeze,
Mhm.
and so like, how do I make sure that I take care of that aspect too? So it wasn't just pure negotiation. It was sort of recognizing that what does she need right now in, just on a sort of human level, to be put into the space and to have to keep going.
That's incredibly interesting, and another thing I think our viewers will appreciate. And then just I guess some wrap up questions apart from preparation for the next life. Do you have what you're working on next settled? I know you always have the multiple projects going, but do you have a clear idea, or is it still feeling things out?
Not any more clear than when preparation happened. I have multiple fiction and documentary projects in development, and it's just I'm a little bit of a workaholic. I'm a Capricorn. Can't shake it. I'm just and I'm just so grateful to be able to, be a working filmmaker, and I want to be able to use this opportunity to really make a difference in the world, and put out work that I think is gonna outlive me. So I think that's what keeps me going on a lot of days where I don't feel like I want to keep going.
When you were younger or even recently, what's one film that made you, when you watched it, said like, "I wish I'd made that," or that's what makes me want to make something?
A lot of films this year have really done that for me. I mean, so many films. Oh god. I mean, yeah. You want me to just pick one at random?
Yeah, no, whatever comes to mind.
I mean, on okay, I'll give one doc example,
Okay.
and then one fiction example. The fiction example, and these are just recent films I've seen. Train Dreams really blew me away. Train Dreams stars Joel Egerton, and it is like adapted from a novella, and it's so literary, and it's like there's a lot that I feel like might not on paper work about it. It's like episodic, it's a little bit messy, there's a lot of voiceover, there's kind of it spans this long period of time. There's like not really one central relationship, but it is a portrait of a man over the course of many years, and it's a period piece, and it just takes some big swings, and it really comes together at the end in a way that reminds me of some of my favorite Chinese films, which take big swings with time and history, and looks at the scope of a life. And it really inspired me when I watched it recently. Uh, and then on the doc side, I just watched this documentary um, that is about many things. It's called Shifting Baselines. Um, but it's kind of focused on SpaceX and what it means for us to be at the dawn of a potentially new era, where we're seeing, um, uh, we're seeing 60,000 plus satellites get put into the sky. We're seeing this gigantic project being uh, lifted off the ground, so to speak, in southern Texas, and it just takes such a unique, almost essayistic. There's a sort of structure in which it has its own logic in this documentary. And it's kind of both familiar but unlike anything I've ever seen. And it taught me a lot about what's happening with our space exploration today and what it means for us as human civilization.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. And then I guess one final question while we still have got some time here. Um, with, coming up and working as a grip or working as a PA or even as a director, was there any piece of advice that has stood out to you that you would think other people coming up, that may have been in similar shoes to you, would benefit from?
I mean, on the crew side, it's just like I know it can be a slog sometimes, especially like if you work in a TV show for 9 months and it's like, you work like 14 hours a day and it's just, it can really wear you down. But I really appreciate the community and the kind of sense of you're just like a random assortment of people that come together and create a family. I think it's really nice. I think being a director is a lot more lonely, and I miss those days when I could just have this community that I could connect with, all the time. That was more accessible. I mean, I have that now, but it just feels like structurally what it means to be a director kind of veers you away from that kind of uh, social reality. But yeah, and then when I was coming up, I did my stuff on the side. I didn't really tell the people I was working with on set like what I was doing on the side, and so they were really surprised once I had some projects go to Sundance. But I was able to do those things essentially with no funding for many years, because I just believed in it enough, and I believed in it enough because the questions I wanted to ask within those projects were big enough to sustain me to be able to want to keep going for year after year after year. I feel like if the question in your project is like too small, I think it makes it harder, I think, for you to just want to stay with it and feel like it's going to be worthwhile for you.
Well, I think preparation for the next life, and I think anyone who sees it and will see it now will absolutely agree that the question was worth making. So, thank you so much for joining us, Bing. It's been a pleasure, and we can't wait to see what you do next.
Cool. Thanks so much, Connor.